Childbirth was just appalling. The Queen lost 3 of her children, not necessarily in childbirth, all of them, but certainly in young childhood. This was a disaster, certainly when her young king-to-be, who should have been Arthur, dies. I mean, that was a disaster to the whole Tudor regime.
Hello and Happy New Year from Aspects of History. My name is Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today I'm talking with novelist Joanna Hickson, all about Henry VII and Henry VIII, and the woman who knew them both well, Joan Guildford, lady-in-waiting to Henry VII's wife. Now, as we've seen recently in this country, the role of lady-in-waiting is not as easy as it seems. Along with the endless parties, dinners, fabulous clothing, and star-studded guests, ladies-in-waiting also have to navigate all sorts of traps in what has always been a dangerous job. Lady Hussey, the Queen Consort's aide, as you may know, got herself embroiled in a race row and has had to step down. I read an amusing story in the Times recently about Lady Hussey in the early 90s. She was at a drinks party at Buckingham Palace and struck up a conversation with a tall American guest. They chatted about the weather and other such trivialities before she asked the visitor what he did for a living. Me? Well, I'm the President of the United States, answered a somewhat bewildered George H. Bush. Several hundred years ago, committing a court faux pas could have landed the courtier in hotter water than that. In Joan Guildford, the subject of Joanna Hickson's new novel, The Queen's Lady, we have perhaps the most skilled lady-in-waiting from history. She was close to Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth was sister to the 2 princes in the Tower, and then later to Henry VIII. So she was an important link between the 2 monarchs. We'll hear in today's chat about Henry VII's reign, the loss of his eldest son Arthur, the experience of women at court, childbirth, as you heard at the top there, and of the youth of Henry VIII. Have we all had a good Christmas and New Year? I hope you had a chance to listen to backlist titles of the podcast. If you can subscribe, I'd be grateful. And if you can rate or review, I'd be even more so. Coming up, I've got the Zulu War, World War I trench warfare, the trial and execution of Charles I, and much, much more. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking with Joanna Hickson. Joanna Hickson, welcome to the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you on, and we're here to talk about your new novel, The Queen's Lady.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
This is great because I've been reading the novel, and it's a period I was talking about. It's the period during the reign of Henry VII for our listeners, so they're aware of what we're discussing. And I was talking to a friend the other day about, we were speculating over who is the greatest king of England or queen. I think Elizabeth always wins the greatest monarch, so I think we were talking more who is the greatest king.
But which Elizabeth are we talking about?
Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I. Yes.
Historically, yes, but
yes.
I think that might change in future, don't you?
Possibly. Although Elizabeth I, I would say, had the power, whereas Elizabeth II.
Yes, that's true.
But we were speculating. Well, he was suggesting Henry VII is his pick for best king.
He's certainly mine. I mean, obviously, I'm very keen on the 15th century, and I think he's certainly the best monarch in that century, because he didn't have terribly much to sort of compare him. A lot of people love Richard III, of course, foolishly.
We will get on to that. That's very exciting.
Well, it's obviously there's a tiny mention of it in here because we talk about it, and I try to avoid it since then in the rest of the book.
Yeah, well, he does loom large. Yes, as you say, in the early stages. But yes, Henry VII's reign is quite a, well, let's face it, it's not particularly exciting reign when one compares it to Henry VIII, but he builds up a fantastic treasury and leaves England in a very powerful position when he dies, doesn't he?
He certainly does, and he did that, what I would say is with rather a bad That was bad in his reign. I think that was the bad section right at the end, when he wasn't a very well man. He'd lost his wife, but we're going to the end of the book before we.
Yes, no, we shouldn't do that. Yes, yes. So why don't we just kick off? If you just, no spoilers, but please just give a breakdown of the plot. Sort of early stage of the plot, because I've been reading it, I'm very, very enjoying it, and I've got loads of questions as a result of.
Well, it is actually a sequel to the Lady of the Ravens, which was set earlier in Joan Vaux's life, when she first came to England, and we got her all sorted out about where she lived. She ended up living in the Tower of London, and therefore became very obsessed with the ravens. But that all happened before. So this starts really with the sequel. It sits on its own. I mean, you can read it without.
Well, I have been.
The rest of it, yes. And were you even aware that there was a prequel?
Well, the Ravens, because the Ravens feature early on in this one, yeah. I did know that you had written the first one, but it didn't take anything away from.
No. So the Ravens, yes, they started off with their sort of fear of setting fear into the heroine Joan, because she suspects that they know something that she doesn't. And it obviously becomes very quickly clear that they did. And her friendship with the Queen Elizabeth of York, is very important at the beginning of the book. And obviously she had been her lady-in-waiting for some years. And I think I find that very sad part of the book in a way. It starts quite sadly because of the situation that the Queen found herself in when her oldest son died. And,
yes.
and
Arthur,
Prince Arthur, who was the sort of beam in the eye of his father, and he brought him up to be the king, and of course he never was, and that was a disaster for him and a disaster for his wife.
How old was he when he died?
He was 15.
Do you know what, Joanna? I was at the British Library the other day for Alexander the Great exhibition, and in their exhibit they had a fantastic set of armor that was made for Arthur, showing periods of Alexander's life, and it's just such a wonderful piece. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it just shows how much, this is just a small indication of how much they were sort of putting into him. Yes,
I have. I don't think I've seen that one. I've certainly seen one of Henry VIII's was made for him, which was fantastic, or is fantastic. I think that's the Courtauld. Anyway, yes, they were amazing. And of course, but the whole point is that Joan Vaux, who is the sort of feature of this book, the central person, she was born during the Wars of the Roses. And of course, this book starts at the beginning of the end of the Wars of the Roses, right when, not this book, but the book pre to this one. And this one then picks up where so this book, we haven't got the Wars of the Roses involved. But of course, they still hover in the background. And everything that was being done in England was still being done by a new king and a new regime. And I think that sort of set the tone. And when the Queen died, of course, it was the beginning of King Henry VII's. He faded after that. He was very, very fond of her, and they were a very good couple. And although we see a slight bit of that at the beginning of this book, that's not what it's about. It's about the sort of success of Henry VII's reign, but the fact that he was desperate to keep it successful. And that, in a way, sort of soured him, I think, for being a happy person. And that showed a lot during the first sort of half of this book, because he started to to become very what's the word for having lots of money, and
like King Midas or something.
Yes, he gathers money, and he finds ways of getting it out of his courtiers and his senior staff, and that becomes very serious in the middle of the book for Joan and her husband, who is Sir Richard Guildford, and he is one of the king's main supporters, and he just the king loses faith with him, because he thinks that he has cheated him and stolen money from his past sort of storage, and it becomes very serious in the middle of the book when this happens, and Joan has to fight her way through this, and through the fact that he is arrested and is taken to jail. So she becomes a very I think the middle of the book is quite sad, really. And then of course we have the success of Henry VIII, who was a very young king. He was only 17, in fact, when he came to the throne. Well, rather not to the throne, because he was actually 18 when he was crowned. And then there's all the Catherine of Aragon saga in there as well. So there's a lot of history which we know very much about, but I don't think we've covered it. I mean, I think this particular book covers a very interesting section of English history that doesn't really get a lot of mention. And
absolutely,
it's what happens between the death of Arthur and the reign of Henry VIII. There is this sad bit in the middle where the King Henry VII becomes less of a good king.
I think we can probably deal with a few of those historical incidents to start with, as you say, in the wake of the Wars of the Roses, and the Queen, the wife of Henry VII, Margaret, her two younger brothers, I think they're younger, aren't they? Are the princes in the Tower. So there's that conspiracy that's sort of it's not really a conspiracy, is it?
Well, it's not a conspiracy. I think, you see, I take the view that if you are king, if you are the king, then you are in charge of the country, and he's certainly in charge of the Tower of London, and that's gone right through history. And
we're talking Richard III being.
We're now talking Richard III, and Richard III made himself king by, how can I express it? What I would describe as not very nice form of parliamentary use. I mean, he went to Parliament and he more or less told them they had to pass an act which made these two boys, who were the right, if you said that Edward IV was the right king, then his sons were the right inheritors. So what happened was that they were made illegitimate by this new law, and that was bad enough. But then when he put them in the Tower, not into the nasty part of the Tower, but into the very smart royal palace in the Tower, I think he never meant to let them out. I mean, whether or not he wanted to get rid of them, well, he did want to get rid of them if he possibly could, but whether he personally had anything to do with their death, he certainly ordered it, because he was the king. He was the only one who could.
Yeah, it's unlikely that he was the one who actually killed them.
Of course, he didn't do it himself. Yeah, don't do they? They send them fight for them and do their nasty work.
Now, well, I'm going to take one position. I will play devil's advocate. Let's pretend I'm a member of the Richard III Society, and this is all.
There are plenty of them around, especially in America.
Well, I hope they're listeners. Let's pretend that I am one of those people, and this is terrible Tudor propaganda. And the princes were well cared for, and they must have just died of a disease. Or I should hold my hands up. I'm not au fait on the current theories behind the Richard III Society's view on what happened to the princes. But this is Tudor propaganda, and you're just encouraging it, Joanna. It's terrible.
Well, because I think the Tudors were a good. They were a good thing, if you like, They were a lot better than what went before, and of course, Elizabeth I proved to be a very strong monarch.
Absolutely.
And I see that whole sort of period, which was roughly 110 years, was a very good time, except for the Mary bit in the middle, when things got a bit hot, if you like, very, very, very fiery. So that I covered all that in the period before these two books that I wrote about Joan. So I kind of have gone right through the century. And I think this is probably the best part of the century. And I didn't want to I did go into the 16th century, but only very briefly at the end of this book. And I couldn't resist going to the Field of Gold in France. So I did do that. But Joan lived a lovely long life. So there was a lot to write about. I mean, she was extremely well thought of, well educated. She spoke 4 languages, which is extraordinary for a woman in her time. And among them was Latin, which made her a very erudite and interesting woman to men, not only to her own sex, but to men, which wasn't easy in those days, because women were considered to be inferior, really, generally, and certainly among those who were educated, the men who were educated. But Erasmus met with Joan in one of the palaces when she was being governess to the royal children, and he was amazed by her, clearly, because he wrote letters to her son, telling him how impressed he was with her and her conversations that he had with her. So, I mean, this is a remarkable thing to have happened to a woman in those days.
I was going to ask, it would have been quite unusual, presumably, for a woman like, a woman to have 4 languages and to have access to such,
Yes,
such
it
people.
would. I think she's almost unique, really, in that case. And the reason she is because when she was a child, I mean, she was not born. I don't believe. We don't know where she was born, but I have because of the way that history has gone, and the fact that her parents were staunch Lancastrians, and had to flee the country when Queen Marguerite, or Marguerite as I call her, Queen Margaret, Henry VI's wife, when they had to flee the country because Edward IV had moved in. She was born very shortly after that, so in about 1463, I think. But there's we don't know the very date when she was born. And I believe that she was born in Piedmont. Now, it sounds a wild thing to say, because it's a long, long way from England to Piedmont, certainly in that period. But her mother was from there, and had come over with her father, who was a doctor to Queen Marguerite. So, I mean, that's a complicated background to start with, but it meant that Joan was born in Italy and was brought up as a very small child with Italian, and her grandmother was Italian, who looked after her a lot. And so then she moved into France, into Anjou, with her father. She went to Anjou and learned French in the Duke of Anjou's children's schoolroom, which he had for them. So that was 2 languages that she had before she even arrived in England. Then she came to England with her mother when her mother brought an army over to try and get King Henry VI back on the throne. And in that very battle at Tewkesbury, her father was killed, and her mother, who was still with Queen Marguerite, was taken to the Tower with the Queen and stayed with her. And so Joan had to be put somewhere. She had to be brought up somewhere. So her mother put her with the wonderful Margaret Beaufort. And so there was she living with Margaret Beaufort in her house. And in that house was a wonderful library. And there were lots of people who came in to teach the numerous children that Margaret Beaufort actually was sort of mother to, in a way. Orphan. They were all orphans. You're an orphan if your father dies. So they were all orphans. And there were quite a few of them there. So that was all a very interesting background. That was all in the book before The Queen's Lady. But I found that a really interesting period because Margaret Beaufort was a very powerful lady in those days. She was another powerful lady. And I think Joan learned an awful lot from her. And she was still very good friends with her all the way through her life. And in fact, was at her deathbed. So there is a good link there. And a lot of this I was research. I mean, I dug out all this, and that was all fact. So you're talking, about a very interesting period in history, which is hardly touched on.
Well, I was going to say, so I was just thinking that when you were saying that. So when you're researching, presumably this is because it's not widely available in, books that are published by mainstream publishers. You're having to do the research yourself. Oh,
absolutely, yes. And it's when you find such an interesting character that you tend to sort of go into depth with it. And I was only intending to write one book, but then I said to my editor, there's 2 books in this because there are 2 definite periods. One, the sort of period straight after when King Henry VII takes the throne, and he literally did take it. I mean, he killed off King Richard and took the throne, which was a remarkable thing to do. That didn't happen very often in England.
Usurper, some might say.
Yes, I don't call him a usurper because I call the other one the usurper.
There are quite a few usurpers during that period.
Yes. Anyway, we've then got the second book, and we should be talking about that because that's.
Well, no, indeed, but it is interesting. You say that you're researching into Joan, who has not really been seen that much in history books, and so that's why historical fiction is important, isn't it? Because as you've just outlined, this is research you've done yourself. Obviously you've read a lot of history as well, but the research you've done has allowed you to write a book about Joan, which wouldn't necessarily have been available had you not done that research. So historical fiction is just this hugely powerful. Well, it's a hugely powerful tool, really, in discovering history.
I think so, and of course it is. I mean, we all think that who write it.
Well, certainly they do. But the reason I ask is some historians take a view that historical fiction is almost dismissed as sort of making things up, which I certainly don't agree.
Well, we do make things up.
Well, but then one wouldn't read any fiction, would we?
No. I mean, that's what makes them less dry than your average history book. And we do, and that's where I say sometimes you get a little bit of there's a hole in the story of Joan, which happens when there is no news of her, and that is actually when Richard III first comes to the throne. And that is an interesting period, and I did quite a lot on that because I found there was this gap in what we knew about her factually. That put me, because I knew from my research that she had a second marriage, and that is what half of this book is about. I was able to use the fact that I knew that happened to find a way of making her known to this second man that she married, which we didn't know at all, but I do because I live quite close to where he lived, and his house is where she ended up living, obviously because she married him. So that house is called Acton Court, and it's not far away from where I live. So I wanted to bring that in and bring him in because it's I wanted to get my county in Wiltshire.
Good for you. That's fantastic. I mean, reading the book, it's interesting how Joan's relationship with the Queen before the Queen. I don't think we could call this a spoiler because it's quite well known. But Henry VII's wife dies in childbirth. But before that, Joan is she's unafraid to give her view, which does cause a problem, doesn't it, with the Queen?
Yes, it does, quite frequently. But she's very fond of Joan, so she does, but she does tick her off.
Yeah, there's undoubtedly a
quite a lot.
mutual respect.
Yes, I think that's right. I don't think that the Queen she wasn't as well educated as Joan, which probably annoyed her. And so she wanted to make sure that Joan knew who was the boss, which is fair enough. I mean, if you're the Queen, you are the boss. And but right at the beginning of this book, that becomes quite important for Joan, because she doesn't toe the line always. And so I mean, this is great. You need to have friction in your stories, because otherwise they would be boring, wouldn't they?
Of course, yes.
If everyone loved everyone else. Certainly not happens in this book. But people I think that people writing about women tend to sort of think that they can't go to war, and they can't do can't have sort of big problems in their lives, but they did. I mean, I think that the childbirth was just appalling. The Queen lost 3 of her children, not necessarily in childbirth, all of them, but certainly in young childhood. This was a disaster. Certainly when her young king-to-be, who should have been Arthur, dies. I mean, that was a disaster to the whole Tudor regime.
Do we know how he died?
Well, it's disputed. I mean, a lot of people think he might have died of tuberculosis, but there was also a lot of sort of flu-like.
Was it sweating sickness? There's this
sweat. Well, sweat was a bit later, officially, but it could have been that. It could have been just an ordinary flu that was, he didn't really manage to kick off. It could have been tuberculosis. He was quite frail. I mean, he was always quite a frail boy, I think, and his father, I don't think, recognized that, because he didn't want to recognize it, and he sent him to live in Ludlow on the Welsh border because he wanted him to learn to be the Prince of Wales, much like what happened to our own present king. And he didn't really. I mean, it's cold up there. It's pretty cold around here at the moment.
Cold, damp, yeah.
Cold, damp, and of course he may well have not thrived on that. Lots of people don't.
No.
So that was a shame.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned contemporary events, because we've also had a lady waiting recently who's come a cropper for saying things, and it made me think during the court life in the court of Tudor court, or any court, how actually you're sort of almost treading a fine line all the time.
Yes,
as a lady in waiting for Joan.
Yes, and Joan was particularly good at that, actually. She, especially with little Henry when he was young, because she had quite a lot to do with him, Henry VIII, because he was she was governess in Eltham Palace, which is where the younger members of the Tudor family were brought up. There was a great friendship between Joan's son and Henry VIII, and secondly, because when she was there, a lot of events took place, like Princess Elizabeth died in Eltham Palace, and that was a sad thing for the Tudor regime. It was a very interesting period that isn't explored at all in history.
Indeed. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about is you've got a very beautiful book cover, and you've just shown me the hardback as well. And we have pomegranates all over, and pomegranates feature in the novel. And I wanted you to just expand on that for me, please, because pomegranates obviously aren't a fruit particularly conducive to the English climate. I wondered the significance of the pomegranate.
Well, obviously, the pomegranate, which I think people do recognise, was Catherine of Aragon's emblem. So she had pomegranates all over everything. because she was Spanish. She came from Spain, and she came from all the way from Granada, which is a very long journey, and it took her a very, very long time to get from her home to actually get married in London. I think it was about a 5-month journey, which is really, and she wasn't well in the middle of it. And I mean, she may never have made it. It was quite a serious thing to do. So the pomegranate she brought with her, and because she was so used to eating it, drinking, she had these drinks made for her, which she liked. And she brought 2 of her maids with her, who made them for her. And of course, it wasn't known much at all in England, but she made it known because she had it all over her emblem. That was, she had it all over her walls and her dresses and things like that. And it makes quite a good emblem, actually. It's a good shape.
Well, it's interesting what you were saying about Henry, Joan's relationship with Henry. As you say, she was his governess, but the way you write about him, because normally we see Henry VIII in the Holbein painting, big, here am I,
bully.
Exactly, yeah, the jolly king.
Mm.
But the young Henry that you write about is interesting because he already seems to know what's required of being a king, and Joan is quite careful around him. Even I think he's a 10-year-old when we're first introduced to him, and Joan is already quite wary of that, isn't she?
Yes, she definitely is. Although he liked her a lot. I think that was very clear. It's certainly clear in my book, and I think history was quite clear that he was quite impressed with her. That he, which was unusual in a way, for a boy of his age. I mean, he loved all the sort of things, that the jousting and the things that he had to learn. He was the right one to be king after his father. I don't think Arthur would have been nearly as good.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, because he was much more academic. While Henry was extremely well read. But he was also extremely well taught on the jousting field, and so he knew about how to
hold a lance,
something like that. So yes, I think that would have been interesting had Arthur succeeded, because I think that Henry would probably have been forced into the church, which would have been disastrous.
Oh wow, that yeah, sliding doors. Gosh,
quite. There he was the king in the end, and for his first 20 years he was actually a very good monarch. And he was very good to his wife. He loved her. I mean, to a certain extent, because obviously you don't have to love your wife if you're king and queen, but you do have to have children, and that was the problem, of course. And she failed him in that, and he thought it was her fault, and so that was a sad thing. But I didn't go into that. I avoided it at all costs.
Well, I was talking to Stephen Virapen on this podcast some months ago, and I asked him, was Henry VIII a good king? And he's not particularly sympathetic to Henry. In fact, he called him a psychopath.
Well, he certainly was at the end. Yes, I think.
Do you think he was a good king then?
Well, I think he started as quite a good king. It's just that, he had that awful fall jousting. And a lot of historians agree that this was the beginning of his bad part, because he probably had, he was seriously injured. I mean, he was out for the count a long time, quite a long time. And he never really recovered from that fall, and he grew much more unpleasant. He was his temper was bad. He had bad wound on his leg, which he found extremely galling. He just was frustrated because he couldn't be the amazingly, charged soldier that he had been before that fall. And so, yes, I think the last part of his reign was a nightmare. But the first part is quite jolly, really. He had a good time. He danced and he did all kinds of music, and he was a good king. Well, why are we talking about Henry the Eighth when I want to talk about Henry the Seventh?
Well, Henry, it's impossible to talk about Henry VII without talking about Henry VIII. But let's go to Henry VII's daughter, Henry VIII's sister, who is important in this book because she is the link between the throne of England and the throne of Scotland. But she is well, there's a proxy marriage, isn't there? And she's so young. It makes one think about the. I mean, nowadays it's difficult to project onto the past, but she's a child. She's 12 years old, I think. She's
13 when she marries. Joan went with her to Edinburgh to see her through, and she'd promised her mother that she would before her mother died, because her mother died when she was just 13, I think. And they just had the proxy wedding in Richmond Palace that made her already James IV's wife, James IV of Scotland's wife. Then, of course, her mother died before she actually went up to the real wedding, which was in Edinburgh. But she did ask Joan if she would see her daughter through this, what was going to be an ordeal for a child of 13. And it was, but she was quite a grown-up 13. Girls can be quite grown up at 13. She was quite steady and quite bright, and she knew what she had to do. But her mother had asked the king to make sure that if she went as young, the king wanted her to go when she was 13 to Scotland, because he was doing this amazing treaty that was going to be the treaty forever of peace between Scotland and England. It lasted about a year and a half, which it wasn't really very successful. But this is what he wanted desperately to make. And so he wanted his daughter to go and be the Queen of Scotland, even though she was only 13. And that had to happen. And she went, and she was okay about it, even though her mother had died and she'd had a bad year. Joan went with her, and although I don't know exactly what went on at that journey, which is a very long journey from London to Edinburgh when you're riding a horse, or in the best thing possible, in one of these nice little carriages. And she had this lovely carriage, actually, which her father gave her some horses, special horses, to take her to Scotland. And unfortunately, there was this fire in one of the castles where she stayed in Edinburgh, just outside Edinburgh, just before her wedding. And these horses died in this fire, which was not suppressed. These beautiful horses with which she was so fond died just 2 days or 3 days before her wedding, which was pretty upsetting as well. So she was quite a strong character. And of course, her mother had told her father, Henry VII, that he had to tell James IV not to consummate the wedding until she was 15, which is quite an awkward thing to do. And so they gave the job to Joan, poor Joan, who was told, more or less to make sure that the king was aware and would comply with this.
And how old was James IV?
He was 32, I think.
So yeah, right.
He wasn't old. I mean, but he was old to her.
Well, I mean, in those days, 15th century, it's early 16th. 32 is not 32 now, is it?
Oh no, not at all. And but he was a man. I mean, she was a little girl. So Joan was given this job to make sure that he understood about this, and I got round this. I'm not going to say what Joan said in my conversation in the book, no. But she didn't manage to totally win. Let me put it that way. So you might find out when you read. I don't know how far you've got, but people will find out what I thought. But I think he did comply more or less. because there was no
more or
child
less.
until she became, I think she had the first one at 16. So I think he waited till she was 15, really.
And well, theirs was an important marriage. It produced James V, didn't it?
It did. She lost a lot of children. Before that, I mean, James the
childbirth in those.
it was terrible. Yeah, and she had. I think there were. I can't remember how many she had, but only one of them really survived to become king, which was quite lucky.
It is mind-boggling, and it's something that I just, it's something that I guess only more recently are we seeing the severe suffering that women had to go through, I think, because before, we always knew life expectancy was short, but that's the reason, really, isn't it?
Definitely, yes. Oh, yes, it is. I mean, there's a whole book to write about that.
We're running out of time, and are you looking to work on a new story?
Yes, I am working on a new story. And I've decided, having got to the end of the 15th century and put Henry into the field of the cloth of gold, Henry VIII, and Joan, I didn't take her to her deathbed. She lived considerably longer than much younger than her husband, second husband, which was interesting. So, and they apparently had a really successful marriage. I mean, you wouldn't have thought that was the case, but it actually was. And it was a love match. These things happen. Look at Joan Collins.
I didn't expect Joan Collins to come up in this conversation.
Well, all the Joans,
Of course, yes, it makes sense now. Joan lived a nice, long old life.
Because I decided, having gone to that end of the 5th century, I wasn't going to go into the 16th century and do Anne Boleyn and all that routine, because it's all been done so much. So I thought back to the beginning of the century, which is what I started with, because I started with Catherine de Valois, who was Henry V's wife, and that was the beginning. She was born in 1401. So I thought, right, well, we'll go back to not quite as far as that, but we'll do the rise of the Seymours.
That sounds quite intriguing.
I think it is. I'm really excited by it. I'm right in the middle of the first one, and it's nicely set in Wiltshire, in Wolf Hall.
It's been wonderful to hear all about this novel. Well, anyone living around a Tudor court who survives with their head and lives to a ripe old age like Joan did deserves all the plaudits they get, and certainly deserves a novel such as this.
Well, I hope so, and I hope people enjoy it, because it shows a very interesting person in some very interesting situations in a very interesting century.
Thank you very much, Joanna.
You're very welcome, Oliver. It's been good talking to you.
As I mentioned before, we've got plenty more content coming up as we start 2023 with some great subjects. Please do share the pod with your friends, as it really helps this independent and small pod to grow. Thanks for listening in 2022, and I wish you well in this new year. Thank you and good night.